Welcome to the China Puzzle. Today we'll be interviewing Professor Kerry Brown, Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London, and Conservative MP for Gloucester, Richard Graham, who's the head of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on China. In part one, we'll be looking at COVID-19 and security concerns around Chinese companies Huawei and Tik Tok. Richard, does the investigation into COVID-19 provide an opportunity for Xi Jinping to take a global leadership role? And is this something that is attractive to him?
First of all, Hannah, good to be on the China Puzzle. Plenty of puzzles in China, plenty of puzzles all over the world at the moment. So I'll try and give some simple answers to puzzling questions. Look, I think for many people here in the UK, the first big question about COVID-19 is, how did it start? What caused it? And there have been two theories sort of mooted in the media. One is, if you like, the conspiratorial one, which is it was all about a leak from the sort of virus institute. And the second one is that it came about through a sort of wet market and via animals. And I think for as long as we don't really know the answer, and we don't know what caused it, there will always be suspicion in some people's minds in the West and here in the UK in particular for this program. So I think one of the key things to the investigation that will inevitably happen and should be led by the WHO in a completely independent way is untangling with China what exactly happened and what can be done to prevent this again. And I think that is the absolute key to rebuilding some of the trust around the global community about whether the right steps have been taken to make sure this can't happen again. The second thing is then, we don't know a great deal about the early steps, the early signals, but of course we do in the West know all about Dr. Li Wenliang. And we know that his sad death was one of several early casualties as a result of COVID-19. And I think we all remember his words towards the end, which were there must be more than one voice. And I think there's enough evidence that has been published for everyone to realize that one of the dichotomies for a very authoritarian one-party regime is how you allow people to have, quote, dissenting, unquote, views. And in particular, when it comes to issues like pandemics and viruses, is it scaremongering, is it fake news, or actually is it for real? How does China allow for doctors to be able to express their own views on things without being penalized by the Communist Party? So those are both challenges. In terms of what then happened, I think it's important for everyone to know that actually the UK sent, I think it was 450,000 items of PPE to China in the early days to help China. And then of course China turned around and helped us considerably later on when COVID-19 was at its sort of peak with us in April and May. So there's been a helpful sort of cooperation on PPE needs. And I think we all need to have more of that sort of thing in the future and going forward. And I hope that that's one element that the investigation will bring out. So more cooperation, more openness, and more knowledge and reassurance about how we're going to prevent this happening again. And all of those things will be very reassuring.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. I think you've summed it up well. I was going to ask you more about that sort of trust and cooperation component. And whether that provides Xi Jinping with an opportunity to take a real global leadership role. But I think you've summed that up well in your answer. So,
well, I think the leadership bit, look, clearly, I mean, politicians of all hues will try and turn events to their political advantage. It's the same in America and the same in China. It's just done in a slightly different way according to very different systems. But I mean, my personal feeling as someone who came to politics relatively late is that the greater honesty and the better the ability to promise less and deliver more is probably healthier in the long term for appreciation of what a politician is trying to do. So there are different tools that politicians in China can use to the ones that we can use in the West. And Xi Jinping has certainly been deploying those tools in China, both for the the control element of the dealing with the pandemic, and then also for the, if you like, the marketing or propaganda side of what the party has done and achieved. My own feeling is that, as a general rule, we need to have more contact between the professionals, between the medics, the doctors, the professors, the academics, and so on, so that they can share more information rather than it being sort of dealt with primarily by politicians. We come in at the moment of crisis management, but the earlier stages and building that global way of tackling these problems, I think, is very often done at the non-political level.
Kerry, what's your assessment of China's handling of COVID-19 in those early days of the outbreak? And what's your view on how China's responded to the international investigation since then?
So when it first became apparent that there was this new disease in China, I think most people, including myself, looked and thought this was going to be a repeat of SARS from 2003. What's probably really changed is since, that time, as the problem spread and became an international problem, everyone has had massive struggles dealing with it. And China is now in this weird position as of, October 2020, where it's got pretty much no infections, or not many, and its fatalities rate has, kind of not been anything like the UK's and nothing like America's. And so, the whole thing has sort of changed. It's made it clear that this was always going to be a really tough issue for any government. And it's slightly changed the framework in which we see the original management of the issue in China. Investigation, well, it's promised an investigation, that's true. And I think Australia was the country that gave the most pressure to have the investigation, but it hasn't given a timeline for that investigation. And I think we can all be a bit skeptical about how open that will be. The Chinese government, is not the world's most transparent organization. But I guess it's the issue is that it does have a kind of bunch of questions to answer, and the world needs to know the answers to those questions. And when this whole pandemic is hopefully resolved, whenever that is, these questions will become ones that are going to need answers.
Before COVID-19, as we entered 2020, one of the biggest challenges facing the global economy was the US-China Trade War. What do you think the US and China have to gain from imposing these penalties on each other?
So in very strict sort of economic and financial terms, both parties normally lose from a trade war, whether it's the US, China, or UK, France during the Napoleonic Wars, whatever the trade war is, invariably both sides lose. There are some interesting side effects. The South African wine business actually was built in the early 19th century precisely because we couldn't get wine from France. So we effectively found somebody else to produce and buy it from. So there are always these interesting inadvertent knock-on effects. In the case of the US-China trade war, clearly the motivation for this from the American side is really all to do with their interpretation of what they see as an abuse of the level playing field to which they thought China had signed up to through the WTO and so on. And the arguments over the years have been to do with not accepting intellectual property, cyber attacks to steal commercial advantage, unfair methods of distribution, uneven access in terms of how much of a joint venture foreign companies could own, access to certain sectors, and all the rest of it. And broadly speaking, that price was accepted by the US at the beginning as part of bringing China into the global structures. But over time, the assumption was that this would lead to a sort of liberal opening up of politics as well, which of course it hasn't. From a Chinese perspective, it's rather different. This is effectively like they've joined the global rules, they've done their bit, and now America is turning around and saying, oh, we're actually not going to have a level playing field anyway, we're going to start discriminating against you. So both sides have got their frustrations, and they haven't been able to resolve these through quiet, active diplomacy, which is perhaps not the hallmark of the Trump regime in any event. And so this is where we are today. And clearly, what America hopes to get out of this, in a sense, is to be able to protect some of its sort of Rust Belt sectors from cheaper imports being, quote, dumped, unquote, by China, in the same way that we've had difficulties with steel coming from China in this country and elsewhere in Europe. And from a Chinese perspective, of course, they would argue that effectively they're financing so much of America's economy by holding huge amounts of dollars in their reserves, which are in turn financing the purchase of made in China goods at cheaper prices by the American consumer. And therefore the consumer is winning, the American economy is winning, and America can run a large deficit decade after decade on the back of China propping up the dollar and the purchasing of their production. So a win-win for both sides. Well, that effectively is being challenged. And I think now what we want to see is leadership on both sides to agree changes, if need be, greater openness, greater market access in China, less belligerence perhaps on the US side, and reach an agreement which will stabilize the US-China trade relationship and thereby benefit the whole of the rest of the world who are involved in the supply chains and so on.
Definitely. And you touched on, the interconnectedness of each economy and the impact this has. I'm interested to know, what you think the ongoing trade tensions mean for the UK. Has UK sort of seen the impacts of these tensions, and will they continue to? So
the UK-China trade relationship is a really important one. It's around $80 billion both ways per year. It's obviously not as big as the bilateral trade relationship with US, which is the biggest single country trade relationship we have. And then obviously the combination of the EU is extremely important overall. So both of those relationships are important to us, and it's important to me and us that we don't end up being the sort of pig in the middle, with two people on either side arguing and somebody in the middle getting squished in between. We want to be able to deal with both countries in slightly different ways, asymmetrically, if you like, but we want to have good relationships with both.
Well, politically, I think the Trump administration felt that the trade relationship and the investment relationship with China wasn't reciprocal. And a lot of people do feel that. I think in Europe too, there's a sense that China's got more from joining the WTO in 2001 than others did, and that there should be a rebalancing. So although there was a lot of drama about the US-China trade negotiations and the announcement in January of the first phase of a sort of deal, I mean, underneath it, I think there was a rational kind of objective. And that was to create a more balanced relationship. Now, of course, with the economic impact of COVID-19, everything is completely changed. Jobs and investment and trade will become really, really important. And it's very hard to judge exactly where that's going to lead us. I guess the issue that has been dealt with, although it's probably too late to have really had as much impact as it could have, is the intellectual property protection that the first phase of the US-China trade deal agreed in January gave. I mean, the reason why I say it's probably too late is, to be honest, this would have been something that would have had impact 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when China was probably in technological and intellectual deficit with Europe and America. And now I think that China in many areas is probably a little bit ahead. AI, artificial intelligence, these areas, high-speed trains, it's very, very good at implementation. And so many areas, it's actually the one that's got the things and the intellectual property that maybe others want to get hold of. So that aside, the deeper structural issues that this US trade kind of negotiation meant to kind of address are going to be totally reshaped by the economic world in which we are now moving, one in which possibly a very, very deep recession or even worse, depression in America and Europe will completely change the way that people think about engaging with China. Will put China may be in a stronger position because it will be restored to growth more quickly.
Well, your point about innovation in China leads me to my next question, which is looking at, some of the kind of great exports of China and successful companies worldwide, such as TikTok and Huawei. They've equally, received a lot of scrutiny around potential national security concerns through the sort of influence of the Chinese Communist Party. Do you think that these concerns are valid?
There are security concerns, inevitably, with any regime which has very different values, very different political structures, is not part of the free world as we tend to define it, i.e. Western democracies. So when it comes to telecoms, when it comes to data in general, which also applies to questions I suspect you've got coming up about TikTok and so on, whenever it comes to data, there's huge sensitivity because data is king, artificial intelligence is vital. China's got some powerful businesses and programs in these sectors. And I think the West is now becoming more cautious about the extent to which it just absorbs them as a consumer. And now we'll be thinking more carefully about the security and supply chain and dependency issues as well. If you're a Chinese company and you're developing all of these things entirely in China, entirely for a domestic audience, you will be, as a business, you will have a Communist Party cell in the business which controls what happens there, not all the commercial decisions, but controls the politics, if you like, of the business. And that company is entirely susceptible to what is a published law in China since 2017, but was a long established practice before that, which was if Chinese intelligence requires access to anything, and particularly any data that business has, then the business has to comply with that requirement. And that, of course, raises concerns with the West, where we're in a situation where China has declared its stated goal as being the dominant world power by 2030. That then reveals to the world, and quite openly so by Xi Jinping, that China wants to be a competitor to take over the position that has been held by America effectively for the last 100 years. And that risks in turn the Thucydides trap. Thucydides, the great Greek historian, who wrote that when one country is waning in power and another rising in power, that's precisely when you get the circumstances for global conflict. And that's what we all want to avoid. So once the pretender to the throne has announced his or her intention, the person sitting on the throne becomes uneasy. And that is where the incredible power of data and artificial intelligence and telecoms and so on becomes more of a threat than an opportunity. And so that's why these things are more sensitive than they are. And it means difficult circumstances for entirely legitimate Chinese businesses with international aspirations, because on the one hand, they're going to be suspected by the US and the West of being up to no good. And on the other hand, of course, they are very vulnerable to being required to do things by the Chinese state, which they might not necessarily want to do. So it's a very difficult balance. For me, I don't see TikTok as particularly threatening in that sense, but it does accumulate a lot of data. Huawei is more concerning, and there are very open reports from the GCHQ cell that works to establish whether there is anything, for example, bugs put into equipment used by Huawei. They end up by being ambivalent. They cannot be sure of their conclusion. So in that context, governments have the security of their nations as their first concern. So inevitably, the West will be cautious. Personally, I'm less worried about TikTok, but different people will have different views.
I mean, security and the party, as you well know in China, it's a close relationship. And the Communist Party would be able to come to any organization and say, we've got these issues and you need to help us. And you can't say no. And I mean, up to a point, security issues are ones about which any organization anywhere has to work with the government in which they're domiciled. But I mean, it's a particularly big area in China, and there's particularly political issues that China regards as, legitimately security ones. I mean, dealing with, people who express the wrong opinions and things like that, for instance. I mean, Huawei and TikTok would be great companies if they weren't Chinese. I mean, the issue is their identity. And, you know, we would just love Huawei if it didn't happen to be from China, because it's, you know, good technology and it's cheap and it's pretty comprehensive. TikTok, I mean, people are addicted to it, you know, I mean, but I don't understand. I mean, I don't really think that their security issues, maybe in the way that politicians sometimes do. I mean, it, as the Edward Snowden issue 10 years ago alerted us to, governments everywhere have been gorging themselves on the sort of harvest that they've got from the internet era, you know, people putting stuff online that was never accessible before. And the Chinese government isn't going to hold back from that temptation too. And the issue really is, what are they trying to achieve, for instance, by having TikTok active in America? You know, what is the sort of real nature of the security threat? I mean, there are security issues about any platform. I'm not a cybersecurity expert, so I won't kind of go on at great length about this, but I think with a company like TikTok, there is, and Huawei up to a point, well, there are security issues probably, although they're hard to define. But I mean, there's commercial issues too, why America or others would want these companies to kind of be put back in their box. And we've got to be very clear-eyed about that. I mean, we don't want to be sort of too accepting of the narratives from any government. I mean, yeah, there's big problems with the Chinese government's narrative, but so the same with European and American ones. So the commercial issues are probably as important. And I mean, at the moment, the TikTok issue is much more up in the air. Huawei, because it's in telecoms, is an easier one to nail. And so that, I think, has been pushed pretty much back. But then Huawei has been very, very successful in other areas in the world, like Latin America and Africa. So its profits and its market have not been too badly impacted by the recent political issues.
That brings us to the end of part one. Make sure you tune into part two, where we talk about the Hong Kong national security laws and what the UK can learn from its closest allies on what to do or what not to do when it comes to engaging with China.